So this is a talk about standards. This comic is actually true, I believe. I'm Harry from the W3C. I work for a standards body, and this is.
I'm waiting for everyone to be. Yes. Thank you.
Everyone, shut up! Blaine started.
Yes. Well, Harry started.
Okay.
You were all talking. No, I'm Blaine, and I'm
recovering
alcoholic.
standards alcoholic.
Yes.
And alcoholic.
It is essential in a discussion about standards to start with the canonical XKCD on the subject. In case you can't read it, or in case you've decided not to read it, I will read it out because it's very important. In the situation where you have 14 competing standards, 14 ridiculous. We need to develop one universal standard that covers all of those cases. Situation, there are 15 competing standards. There was a discussion recently that I was having. Well, there was a guy at a conference a couple of weeks back who was he literally said, "Ridiculous! We need one universal standard," and we were just like, we had to tie him down. Like, no, stop it. So this is sort of like we're going to go through the history of sort of social web standards because I think that's where a lot of the energy in sort of decentralization has gone into these standards that ostensibly will help us cooperate and collaborate and communicate.
So we're not going to cover stuff like Tor, for example, various direct peer-to-peer standards. We're going to cover stuff that comes through more or less two standards bodies and a few of their spin-offs, IETF and W3C, although the space is much larger, but this is an important stream of work. Because I don't want to be like the grumpy old guy at the conference, but I am the grumpy old guy. And I'm older than I look, man. Tear gas keeps you young. But the problem that we have is that someone's like, I have this great idea for like logging in without passwords, or like, oh man, like it will be really amazing when we could just like share status updates. And like, oh, we had this conversation 10 years ago. And so we're going to give a quick review of why we tried all this stuff over the last. People have been working on this stuff really heavily for 15 years, and what's worked and what hasn't, and it's mostly not worked. So I do want to begin with this. This is actually quite important. So before Friendster, I don't know if people even remember Friendster, before Facebook, and even before MySpace, there was a kind of like weird like white paper written by a bunch of crazy people in First Monday called the Augmented Social Network. And they were sort of saying, well, the web pages are cool, but what would be even cooler would be a world in which like everyone owns their own personal data. And we have these like trust relationships. And like, oh, maybe like there'll be like direct democracy. This will be even amazing on like a global scale. And this would be the one thing we can do to like make the web even. This was even before Snowden, so there's no negative feelings. There's like the web would be even more awesome when we do this. So when everyone's like, yo, I've invented a new way to like, I have this great idea about like decentralizing the web and like sharing our personal data. Like, I mean, the TLDR is many other people have had this idea for a very long time. And I think this might be the first one that at least I've seen that really went through it. Although they didn't actually produce any technical work. It was like a weird white paper. And then there's RDF, which I'll let Blaine talk about a bit, but I mean, the thing with RDF is it's been around a while, right? So the semantic web is not a new vision. It started in '99, and the first real usage of it was kind of cool. Like, there was the Iranians, well, not this part, this part was bad. The Iranian government was oppressing their citizens, and they were taking down the social networking tools, very early ones that Iranians were using, and it occurred to Dan Brickley that there should be a sort of way to transport your social data from one network to another. So he invented using RDF. So this is before JSON, and it looks a little JSON-esque, right? It's not so many angle brackets, and this is kind of what you ended up with. But Blaine, what's your take?
So because this is an exercise in critique, let's think about the social construct of this. Basically, what was proposed is we're going to stick a plain text document out in the cloud that has a list of all of your friends and how much you like them. And we're going to use that, like we're just going to fetch it from some web resource, and then we'll munge it through some data, and then we'll get, like all of the information that those friends have also publicly presented online, to you. There's no concept of interaction. There's no concept of anything. It's just like, hey, your friends have some data. Here is data that is related to your friends. You have stated in this document over here that you really like this person, so we're going to show you all of that information. And it's like yeah, this is basically what Facebook does, except this was like, we'll just put it all online. It'll be great. We'll just stick it up on the web, and it'll be fantastic, and we will live in a panacea of linked data.
And what happened with the standardization process is that the original RDF spec published in 1999 was missing what was called formal semantics. And then like 6 years later, they published a spec of formal semantics, and then like 2014, recently, they finally fixed some of the errors in that, and that was a new spec. So the standardization process of the RDF community, the semantic web community, which got rebranded, linked data with a bit more utility and like a lot more usage in 2006, has just been going on for a really long time. I mean, it's a vibrant community, but it's also been around more or less since the beginning of the decentralizing the web stuff.
It occurs to me now that we're thinking about it, just on the RDF thing, there's a cautionary tale I think that everyone can identify with. Part of the work that came out of those projects was a project called EmotionML, which was an XML markup language to describe how you felt about different things. So like that was a whole structured language for describing your emotions.
I don't know where that went. We're not going to talk about that standard here. But okay, so then there's RSS. So RSS, it's a long story. It was originally Guha, who was involved in RDF and Semantic Web, and it was called RDF Site Summary or something like that. And so that was the first version. And then it kind of like, basically that was 0.9, and then they basically went to 0.91 and 0.92, which basically did get some uptake. In particular, you could sort of add, what they did is they stripped all the RDF out because it was too complicated. People were using XML, it was very popular at the time, this is 99. And they put in basically things that allow, for example, audio files to be shared. And this led to podcasting, amongst other things.
And I think, in sort of thinking about where standards fail, RSS is a great example of the sort of ego-driven failure mode.
It was very successful. It was very successful, RSS. It was one of the biggest until 2004, growing exponentially.
But
so just calm down a little bit with your cynicism. It's just.
I don't need to.
So we did consider.
It's frankly unpleasant.
Just let us finish it.
This kind of, especially by you, Harry Halpin, who's running a social web.
We're going to get to that word.
It's completely catastrophic failure.
You've had your session.
Because you're trying to get people together.
So Henry, as I said before, shut up.
No, shut up.
When we talked about failure, we basically thought of putting.
No, come on.
We're not talking about you, so don't worry.
No,
Henry, don't worry. We're gonna take the piss out. We're gonna take the piss out of our own projects later too.
Other people have left because there's just no discipline. You're trying to get independent groups like IndieWeb to work together, and they don't even want to listen to the mailing list. So it's a complete mess.
Yes, because all standards happen over mailing list.
Yes,
we'll get back to so, okay, so let's get back to the story.
So he's such a pain in the neck. This guy. I hope he's going to get thrown out of the W3C because he's just breaking standards.
Henry.
No, I'm just making that point because you're standing here and he's just trying to break people's work.
Why don't you listen to our talk and then maybe we can discuss afterwards?
Yeah, no, I'm just making the point here that you're unpleasant and I really dislike what you're trying to do.
Well, you could have talked to me before the talk, but it's not my fault some things aren't working for you. So let's keep going.
Yeah.
Well,
So
we're going to explain why, actually.
So I think the fragmentation that you see here. There's names next to all of these things, and the reason that the names are next to all of these things is because these projects were forked by different people who wanted to put their name behind the different version number. And even Atom, which was ostensibly like a project to bring which was a project to bring the community together, and they basically, because they didn't want to sort of go with either of the various factions, they said, okay, well, we're going to create another one, and we're going to put our name on it, but it'll be a collective name, so it's okay. And it's like, this is not a great approach, and ultimately because of
it's very successful.
Henry,
Ira here. do we have to remove Henry's story from the room? I'm okay with that.
Yeah, no, you're like...
Because I think this is...
everybody out.
No, I'm not, I'm just trying to talk. I'm not just...
Henry, shut up.
Okay, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Let us finish the talk. Okay, it's not that hard.
Oh God. Right. So, anyways, as a result of all this fragmentation, like we don't use this technology anymore. It's really sad because it was a great technology.
So XRIs are interesting. So XRIs are extensible resource identifiers because it occurred to some people. They're like, well, URLs, they're sort of useful for web pages. And they didn't really buy the semantic web line that you wanted a URL to identify a person. So they said, let's go for extensible resource identifiers, which would be like a special name. Like Drummond Reed, who was like the main pusher behind it, with an equal sign or a plus sign if you're a phone number or organization. And you would have like basically a specialized domain system to identify people and phone numbers and stuff. But the problem with this is like, it's actually a sneaky business plot where you're like, I'm going to invent my own version of the domain name system that you're going to have to like basically, you know, that I'm going to patent, and then you're going to like have to buy into this to use open identity, right? So it's kind of like, the thing which is interesting to point out is there's a lot of like sketchy snake oil in this space, but it's very hard to distinguish sketchy snake oil from like genuine standards. So this stuff got pushed through OASIS, which has non-royalty free policy. And I generally think like when you talk about standards, the real value of standardization comes through often the patent commitments, so you know you're not doing anything patented, and it comes through like the sort of actual community process. And I am concerned, you know, when something actually is mature, it should probably go through a standardization process. However, what a lot of people did, and XRIs is a great example of why it fails, is you basically say, I have a sketchy business plan, or maybe I'm a good guy, but I don't know why people aren't using my technology, so I'm going to push it through a standards process and like people use my technology, which for XRIs was more or less a failure, which is why you don't see them very much right now.
And I think it sort of goes, hang on one second. Sorry. I just want to point out like some of the design thinking here. We have phone numbers that they've said, okay, well, we're reinventing these technologies, so we need to distinguish it from the previous technology. So we'll just reverse them. We'll just reverse the way that phone numbers work. And that sort of, you know, that will make it a new technology. And you know, I think when we're thinking about the way that we develop standards and the way that we approach standards, if there are existing patterns, use them. Don't try and like create entirely new interaction models and entirely new approaches just because you have some technology that's sort of a thing that you want to do. We want to like really embrace the fact that people do things already and they understand things, and we want to encourage them, not discourage them.
So XMPP. So actually XMPP had a lot of success. It was an XML-based messaging format, had a very good push model, something that was very hard to do with HTTP, had a naming system.
Yeah, so there were a lot of people who probably used XMPP. So Google Talk was XMPP based. There were, you know, lots of different corporate messaging services that were based on XMPP. Jabber is the other term for it. It's still used. Google Talk still uses it. But I think the fundamental failure of the XMPP sort of standards effort was that there were just too many of them. So you know they have, I don't know how many XCP. So they have this extensible standardization process, and they started out with just the core that was great. And then they added at least 350 other standards, and each of those standards were sort of hundreds of pages long. So the ability of people to sort of sit down and implement these standards that, you know, would interoperate, and they were great and they worked, was just basically non-existent, because to sit down and implement something, you had to read 350 pages first, and that was just the standard. Your code would be, you know, 10 times that length if you implemented all of the things that they sort of said you needed to do in order to interoperate. And so I think that sort of failure by over-specification.
Small question. What kind of stuff do those initial standards specify?
Well, you probably use off-the-record messaging, for example. I mean, like, there's all sorts of stuff that you can do with chat.
Or like with publish, subscribe, you know, sending and receiving messages. So this is a good example.
It wasn't the core message passing functionality.
It was like basically they described every single decentralized application that you could possibly build on top of a real-time messaging network, and it's all there. It's all documented. It's amazing.
Yeah, like
but
Google Wave uses XMPP. I think that Google Docs decentralization thing they showed off here uses XMPP. It still works. You can use it. Buddy Cloud. There's decentralized social networks using XMPP. You can still run XMP server,
So
chat.
you support a whole bunch of applications.
But it's like
Yeah.
it's not the current XMPP is not doesn't work, because it does work. It's just like, why didn't it have any more take up? It seemed to be like it was going really well, then kind of stalled.
So they didn't leave the creativity up to the developer, right? It's as though with HTTP, we have this model where we've got a web server that takes requests, and then you pass it back to an application server and you write your application. And it's as though the HTTP standards people had described every single web application you could possibly build in the standard way to do that. And so by doing that, they stifled creativity. And so I think if you're developing a standard, try and define the minimum that you need to interoperate that allows for creativity and innovation and all of these sorts of things. I think that's the lesson that we should learn from XMPP.
OpenID is a whole other set of lessons. So OpenID actually started pretty early. I forget precisely.
2004 maybe?
2004-ish.
Something.
Yeah, and it was the same vision. It was like, I want to be able to log in, ideally some sort of single sign-up mechanism across all sorts of websites, because I have too many websites. There was even more social. Right now we're facing the hegemony of Facebook and Twitter and a few, but 2004, it was a little wild, right? So there's lots and lots of social sites.
OpenID came out of LinkedIn, sorry, not LinkedIn, LiveJournal, sorry.
Which also exported photos.
Yeah, and the idea was that you could sign into your friend's LiveJournal site through OpenID. But the problem, I think, with OpenID is that they created this sort of technical infrastructure, but they abstracted out the human. So I saw this picture, and it was like, want to sign up for a food mart membership? No thanks, I'll just use my OpenID. And it's like, what is the interaction there? This makes no sense. The idea is that you've sort of become your OpenID, and in a way that it just doesn't make any sense. It's not like there's a credit card where there's some abstract thing that you're talking about. It's just like your identity is this abstract thing, and this is the peril of getting too caught up in sort of technological stuff. And so they talked about we can pass these tokens around and sign people in, but they forgot about the human in the interaction.
Yeah, and what this led to, because everyone's like, oh, you can just identify yourself using your OpenID identifier, which was a URI, and it was not so bad, but the fact of the matter is people found it really impossible to figure out. So they go to Google, which supported OpenID, and this is the thing to also remember, a lot of, in the early days of the centralizing of the social web, most of the larger social web things were actually pushing out decentralized open standards, and the key was no one was using them. So you go into Google, you're like, oh, I can sign up my OpenID. Maybe you still can, I never figured out they cut off. But essentially, nobody did that. Like literally version on 0. And there's well, this is a lot of work. People aren't understanding this concept of my identifier for myself across all my different websites. Yeah. So that's an unfortunate one. And then OAuth.
Then we get to OAuth. I'm sorry. So OAuth, actually, the impetus for OAuth. So I was working at Twitter. We were building the API, the first version of the API, and I wanted to support OpenID because OpenID is cool, and we want people to be able to sign in using whatever identifier they want, and we don't want to manage passwords and all of that kind of stuff. But we had this API, and if we supported OpenID, and people wanted to sign in to their client, like their Twitter client that was installed on their phone, but they didn't have a password, how do they sign in to Twitter? I have to give them a password now, which obviates the whole idea behind OpenID.
So what was happening actually is in order to access data on other people's machines, they would be like, hi, I'm Facebook, please give me your Gmail password, and I'm going to get some personal data of yours out of Google. But they could also get, read all your emails, right?
So we went and we tried to make it work with OpenID, and it was too complicated a protocol, so we're like, okay, well, we'll just build this OAuth thing, which to start was fairly simple, and I think has been reasonably successful in terms of adoption. It's kind of a pain in the butt, partially because it's a security protocol that exposes the security dynamics, which is probably a good thing, I think, except it's really complicated. Because in order to implement it, you have to get it right, and that's I think that's you want to fail closed, right? When you're designing security protocols. It then descended into a terrible morass of sort of standardization debates, and we went through 3 or 4 different versions, and there were umpteen different proposals, and we didn't say no. And so we ended up with OpenID 2, which is just like, hey, you've got HTTP, you can do security, and that's basically all it says. So it leaves people in this like, I don't know what to do, and that was a failure of our community to sort of have a clear vision and define something that was usable for people and interoperable. So,
although that being said, I know you're very sorry about OpenID. Sorry, I mean you're open OAuth, but the key thing is what's happening is that OAuth, of all the standards out of the space, has been by far the most successful. There are probably, every time you go into Google, Twitter, you're using OAuth when they ask you to authorize using one of your accounts. And other sites which don't use precisely OAuth but are quite close, Facebook Connect, it's sort of the same general model. And the general model, which has proven to be tremendously successful, and probably there's more OAuth transactions than Visa transactions, is, I want to access some data, here's a token, user basically authenticates to the service, authorizes that token passes back, token is time delimited and scope delimited. And now a lot of work is on how do we bind this token more securely using various kinds of key material. But it seems like that general sort of how do we access stuff on other server sites with some measure of capabilities, OAuth has fit a niche within the larger market, which I think none of the other social standards have actually managed to get that level of traction.
So I would claim that OAuth is not a social standard at all. It's just a permissions thing.
Permissions for data, yes.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why it succeeded.
Yeah.
So OpenSocial is a funny one. So OpenSocial, so basically, Google's freaking out over Facebook, and they're like, oh, why don't we create like a single sort of social layer that is decentralized. So people design social apps based on the user's profile data across different sites, which sounds similar to what some other people here are saying. And it had some problems.
Yeah, I mean, basically it was just, you could embed sociality, decontextualize within essentially, it was a portal model for the social web. So the idea was that you would go to Google and install other sites inside Google. And so there was a whole bunch of standards effort basically driven by Google's profit motive, saying, hey, we need to have a portal that everyone goes to. You guys should build things for us. And we're going to spend a bunch of open standards effort to make sure that looks like it's a legit open thing. So the only lesson from this is beware corporations when they say they're doing standards.
Although it had this interesting afterlife in the enterprise space before finally keeling over and dying, and the work was shipped to W3C for IPR reasons. So PubSub and Solomon are very interesting. So one of the problems you have, you're like, okay, we have some data on some site. You've updated your decentralized site. How do I know you've updated? And you have basically the polling problem. That you basically have to poll some site constantly to figure out when things have changed because HTTP doesn't have a clear push mechanism. And this is basically, it's a little bit like I'm going to do a decentralized denial service attack or just waste a lot of time polling.
Yeah, so PubSub was basically a re-implementation of XMPP, PubSub, over HTTP. So just said, we don't need the sort of complicated XML schema, we can just do this over HTTP. But I think it came at a time when the big social networks, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram by this point, Instagram starting, and Google Plus were entrenching, and they're like, actually, we're not going to cooperate. And so there were a bunch of people within Google, Twitter, and a couple of people at Facebook actually who worked on this standard, but by the time the standard was sort of ready and being presented for use, the social networks were too big and they were just entrenched, and they're just like, we're not going to implement this.
There's a very interesting research problem which Solomon Protocol tried to address, which I think people in this community haven't actually solved. So the problem is this. We're a decentralized social network. I get your blog post because I'm subscribed to as, they would think your Atom feed, but it could be some other feed of RDF data, feed of activity streams, whatever. And I write a comment. That, Solomon, they swim upstream, and you have to have that comment propagated back to the original source and then sort of synchronized among everyone that's subscribed in this decentralized way. And of course, what this immediately leads to is like a spam attack, right? So you don't want random people to subscribe into your decentralized network and then spam the hell out of you or abuse it. The problem that Solomon recognized, which was not clearly recognized beforehand, was that decentralization often actually works against security and to a large extent privacy. And this is, Salman had some early work with keys and trying to say, well, you have to authenticate yourself and verify yourself, and then we can send the message back up and down. Protocol got so complicated, I think only Evan Prodromo actually ended up coding it. But it was there was some really good ideas in there that should be revisited. The favorite, the like button. So it's really funny. So the story here is pretty straightforward. The like button was what happened is there's all these decentralized enthusiasts, and then some of them were like, oh man, I need a job, or the companies they're working at, like, weren't doing very well. And Dave recorded, who co-authored with Brad Fitzpatrick, this idea of really this manifesto for decentralizing the web. He goes to work for Facebook. I'm like, oh, that's great. Maybe Facebook will decentralize. And then immediately what happens is the like button, right? And the like button, the Open Graph Protocol, it was on some level a critique of what's called microformats. I don't know if people here know what microformats are, but microformats are effectively, you put in div and span tags, build with data, so you can actually embed like your vCard, your calendar into the HTML, and then theoretically you can scrape it out. And that actually had a lot of uptake. What kind of went wrong, what the critique of Facebook is like, web developers are too stupid to embed things properly in HTML, so we just put in the meta. And they're like, decentralized vocabulary, so we really need that? Like, there's a pretty finite amount of things that we as Facebook are interested in, so we're going to describe that vocabulary. That's the Open Graph Protocol. And then, we have to put it in the header of the HTML file, and they were like, what should we do? And they're like, they sent, okay, RDFA. We're gonna use the RDFA statement to put this in. But the funny thing is, when you start trying, I did this. I went to Facebook and described them in detail, the right way to do it, with RDF and with blank nodes. And I was like, this would be great. And then, of course, when it finally ships, there's like no blank nodes. I'm like, what the hell? And they're just like, whatever, we don't care. People don't know about blank nodes. They can't use RDF anyways. It's a great way to put metadata into HTML header. And this went viral, but it's not real. It is kind of a graph. It's definitely not open, so it's a very good exercise in labeling.
I think they should have called it HTML for Facebook.
Yeah, HTML for Facebook, and it was very successful. And it shows how concepts from decentralization end up shaping really core elements of the web experience today. And at the same time, immediately when the like button came out, the decentralization stalwarts were like, this is great, except for the fact that like ships up all the way to Facebook. Couldn't we make the like button ship somewhere else? Like, why doesn't my like button ship to my personal website? Or I control the data, so they made open like, and yeah, no one cared. It had absolutely no use. So W3C, we didn't actually put a graphic here. We haven't quite given up, mainly because we haven't really been involved. So most of these standards happen to IETF and in other communities. And what's happened, particularly, I think the suite of standards out of this sort of first wave, I guess you guys are like the second wave, but like the first wave of decentralizing social web, produced a bunch of standards. They all kind of knitted together, and they were all like in different places on different websites with weren't really interoperable. Like the libraries were some of them were really good, some of them had like total mass adoption, some of them no one even knew about. And so it was just basically you wanted to make a decentralized social web application using a lot of this stuff. You could, in theory, and Evan Prodromo did, and other people like Status.net, and I didn't, they worked really hard, but ultimately it was too complicated. And they're like, what W3C I thought should do is we should simplify it. We should make it simplified. There was like this whole fight in the early days. Maybe you want to talk about the metadata fight, the activity streams metadata fight.
What was that?
When they had to describe the whole world in a single vocabulary. I can describe it. So activity streams, was basically saying, let's take Atom, which we know works, let's add social activities to it. But the problem with this whole approach is that effectively, you have an endless vocabulary, you have an endless list of possible social usages, right? All sorts of things you have with social objects, likes, dislikes, kicking people, who knows, all sorts of things. And the fact of the matter is when you start making this unified vocabulary, totally fell apart. And everything was...
If you're trying to discuss a standard about like syndication, and then you start debating the semantics of the metadata that you're putting into that syndication standard, like now you have a million problems because it's just, like you're just never going to agree. And so
so we got a proposal to say, let's do a JSON format. Let's use URIs in an extensible manner to describe activities. And that's pretty good. But what immediately happens is, like, you know, we were very generous. We said everyone, we wanted the whole community, because to be frank, the first generation of the decentralization efforts were clearly sort of dying out, not doing very well. IndieWeb was getting some hype and some progress, and that was good. They had some working stuff. Evan was still interested. You know, the activity pump community was still there. The RDF community was jumping on and really into the personal data stuff. So we thought it could all work together. Of course, what happens, we've been a bit logjam because everyone's like, oh, I want my favorite format, and you really have to care about my MIME type. And of course, what's happened is, like, we start the working group and there's been not much progress because the communities are so obsessed with the little details of their standards, which actually most developers don't care about, that we haven't quite solved it yet, but I still have a lot of hope over the next year or two we can make a big push and actually get everyone to, like, drop their egos and drop their, like, weird emotional and religious fetishes about my metadata vocabulary or my RDF or micro formats or whatever, and just, like, make something which is baseline interoperable. No one's going to win completely, but ideally everyone will be able to interoperate, because that's the point of standards and blockchains. So this is a real quick moment. Okay, so I'm sorry. I'm not a huge, like, you know, Ethereum. It was interesting, man. But no. But there's a really good idea there. Okay, there's, like, a really good idea, and the good idea is, like, excessively simple, which is that there is this giant. Everyone's like, the web is decentralized, and yes, linking is decentralized. It's clear Tim Berners-Lee is a genius for, like, putting hypertext and links on top of TCP/IP. Great move. There is this, like, relic that runs the entire web, and no one really talks about it. It's really the biggest problem, and it's the domain name system, right? So the domain name system is centralized, as in, if you ever look at a map of the core domain name servers, they're like, oh, they're in mostly America and the UK, and maybe one in Sweden and Japan, because, you know, they're nice countries. So there's a lot of legitimate problems with this current setup. It's centralized, it's geopolitically dominated by the United States and Five Eyes, and the entire internet is basically dependent on it. Now, ICANN has a very nice constitution, and the meetings are nice, they fly in people from different countries. The fact of the matter is, it's a centralized system. So everyone's like, well, why don't we just replace it with a decentralized system? And that's, NamePoint was probably the most interesting attempt to do this on the blockchain. But what happens with NamePoint, right? So you say, I go to google.com and NamePoint, I get, like, a random squatter, right? So immediately, people, when URLs become so embedded in code that, you know, people want to go, they want google.com to go to google.com, right? There's a whole, it's not just the technology, there's a whole social infrastructure around expectations and how domain name systems works. It also has to be friggin' quick, right? So this is not really the blockchain's, like, best, not what it's best at, right? So it's a good decentralized alternative, but it fails on the social level because it's been domain name squatted really quickly, and it's unclear if it really scale. So Vint Cerf, you know, inventor of the internet, TCP/IP, basically sort of said, we understand ICANN has problems, but it's the best we have right now. Now, I do think that if there is a good decentralized alternative, I think very few people seriously thought this one through. It would be a mammoth win, and it could really solve a lot of problems, and that's the core problem we face today.
Doing a little summary of how that might work.
In the question answer, because we're on the last slide, man.
Sure.
Okay,
I think the other thing that I mean, personally concerns me about blockchains is that I think it's falling into the sort of technology thing again, and sort of losing the focus on user needs. So, like, I recently bought my first Bitcoins. It took 2.5 days, and I wasn't sure if it was going to work. And I'm not very smart, but I'm not really stupid either. You know, like, and so to be at this point where, like, I find this challenging, and I don't know how to send Bitcoins to other people, and, like, I need these basically companies that have been set up with VC money to make it almost easy enough to send Bitcoins across, you know, like, this is supposed to be decentralized. I'm supposed to be able to do this on my computer, and I need to rely on, like, some startup to be able to do this.
This is like, who do you trust less?
We've lost the focus here.
Do you trust Citibank or Royal Bank of England, like, more or less than you trust, like, 3 dudes in a startup with all your money? I don't know. Like, it's really, like, a bit surprised Bitcoin is like as popular as it is, right? And the thing which people feel like, oh, it's totally decentralized, but in reality, and this is the issue with a lot of these standards and code bases, as the should we expand the chain or not argument is shown, the power is actually in the core devs, right? So core devs can do commits, do resolutions, and like that's a lot of power. So you cannot forget that when you talk about decentralization. It's not just the technical architecture, it's the social architecture. Who controls the code? Who gets commits? Who doesn't? Like all that stuff, super important. So now for the final.
So basically the standards that we've talked about, we sort of thought about it, and like they really fall into 4 categories. We didn't talk a lot about identity because people don't deal with identity. But if you look at the successful social networks out there, you've got Twitter with the @ handle, right? Like you go to a conference and it's like, what's your Twitter handle? What is that in this decentralized social web? Facebook gets into a lot of trouble because they're like, you have to show us your government ID. Well, that's a really powerful thing for them to have because they have a better a better user authentication database than any government agency on earth. It's pretty significant, right? Like, what? Have they changed it?
It's never been explicitly government ID. They use that as an example.
Oh, okay.
That would fulfill their criteria, but you can authenticate through non-government ID.
Oh.
Such as your open ID. sorry. Because everyone's using their open ID.
Excellent. That is great clarification. I did not realize that.
Particularly if you're a UK national.
Okay.
Because there's actually we're not breaking any law by being like names. You can use ID or have work related ID in any name you like. Facebook is actually a name. There's no problem with it. Say no, but you're not breaking any law by using any ID you wish to, as long as you're not using it for anything.
Yeah. I mean, technically, Facebook couldn't. I hope they don't have laws. But policies.
So Blaine, let's just go through the final slide, and I think we're running out of time. So.
But yeah, point taken. So I think identity is a big missing one, and we don't have good answers to it in the decentralized world.
And just by the way, answers aren't simple, right? OpenID also is like, yeah, your ID is just a URL. I mean, it's a little bit trickier than that, right? It's a lot about the social, how humans interact, how they think of themselves.
Yeah. And then you've got discovery. So that's the discovery of the discovery. I think this is dead. Sorry. The discovery of how. So once we've identified someone out on the web that we want to interact with, how do we discover the sort of interoperable mechanisms that we can then interact with them? And so none of those standards, all of the standards just assumed that you would be talking that standard. But there's no sort of negotiation around that.
Do you support OpenID? Do you support Web ID? Do you support government ID?
Yeah. Do you support PubSub Hubbub or XMPP or like how do we negotiate that sort of communication? And I think ultimately, if we look at the examples from the internet, TCP/IP 1, DNS 1. So there will be there will be standards that just win, and we won't really need to do this discovery at this level, but we kind of need something along those lines. There's the transport, so this is the XMPP and the PubSub Hubbub and like RSS and Atom and all of these sorts of, and HTTP really. So it's like, how do we transport the data? That's still a big open question. No one's sort of come up with a conclusive answer for that. And then there's the metadata, which is the favorite of bike shed painters everywhere. It's like, because you can just talk about that stuff forever. And I think that, we didn't really talk about the indie web folk, but I think there's something interesting. I take a lot of issue with their sort of like, I'm building this for me and not for other people, because us technologists, we can build these systems for ourselves. The challenge is building these things for other people. But on the other hand, what they're doing, going and building services for themselves, way more productive than arguing about ways that you could build services for other people and failing at it.
Yeah. So I mean, as the sort of final comment, so I'm just going to say that here's some good reasons to do standards, and here's some bad reasons to do standards. So I'm going to go for the bad ones first. So bad reason to do standard is you think it will attract users. Actually, users don't care about standards. They don't even notice them. That's the point. They should be invisible. So if you're trying to like push a crazy idea or your idea, or even what you think is the best idea ever, through a standards body because you think this will somehow help uptake, it's the wrong way to do it. It really is. And please stop doing that. We have a lot, it's so common. The other problem is emotional attachment to standards, including your own work and previous work of people you like. So often, like, things don't work. Like, there's a pretty long trajectory, you know, around a lot of these standards, and you know, there's a lot of reinvention of the wheel. At the same point, like, you know, when you shove XRIs into OpenID, didn't help OpenID adoption at all, because like, I have to read this giant XRI thing. You know, RSS and Atom mostly end up is back and forth removing RDF every few years. And you know, it's standards aren't about like, shouldn't be about a religious war about like how you conceive the universe. Okay, it should be minimal, it should be short. So what's the good reasons to do standards? Oh, you shouldn't do standards to be famous. Right. I mean, you might get like some geek street cred, but like essentially, when you've done like enough standards, like the whole landscape just shifts every 10 years anyways. So, you know, you're like, oh, I'm so cool, and my name is on XML, emotion ML, like XML emotion language. And like, man, like that'll be a joke in 10 years. And it could be super successful, but actually that's gonna look bad on your resume. Because I was like, I don't use XML, I use JSON. You know, I mean, that's just like, there's just like this common like churn, and it's not your fault, it's like part of how reality works. Things get older, new technology gets developed, fashions change, right? We are seeing some trends in fashion that seem to be long-standing. So one is keep it simple. Specs which are short, have more success. The other is aim for the 99%. Like specs that rely on idiosyncratic or really hard to implement technology are generally never going to be implemented. And everyone's like, oh, I have this great library. Well, sometimes that works if you're like Node.js. Often doesn't work, right? So you try to keep the functionality basically minimal. And the third most important thing, and there's one exception to this rule. I'm gonna go through the exception first. If you want to add stuff to a platform you don't control, and you have a cabal of friends who work for that platform who can implement, and there's a good business case, maybe, depends, to be made about implementing that, you can use standardization to get things in, you know, for example, browsers. And that's actually a pretty useful thing. So you can it's not the best methodology, but sometimes it's your only option. But the best methodology, which is clearly work with things like OAuth and whatnot, keep it simple, get the code working on your own site. When you start seeing like large amounts of usage, it's time to get a standard. If you're not seeing large amounts of usage, like, do not get the standard. And then the standardization gives you the sort of process, the review, and the patching commitments that make it safer for the free and open source communities to implement. So that's it.
Can we... That was useful. Questions and comments and discussion. I don't know how much time we have.
I don't know.
The community is actually in contact with regarding decentralized systems like TOPS, spam replacement stuff, or own cloud, doing like a kind of a successful file storage stuff, and IndieWeb also, I would say, and many others. They don't seem to think much about standardization or specification at all. They rather think this is all, I mean, especially from this kind of talk, you also get the impression, oh, it's all a big mess. You know? And it is to a certain degree, right? So they rather focus on getting something working. But that kind of like, on some level, you have like a big community that kind of like this involved in certain code base, and that publishes software that is used by many people, then they have a certain kind of control. And even though they are not Google, you know, you run basically, even if it's open source, into a similar problem of control, like centralized control, right? And at what point, actually, I mean, I think it's good to have some kind of actually working code, and people use it, and you can see it actually makes sense. But at what point, you know, is it sensible to try to standardize it, to actually have other implementations? It's really a hard problem. It seems like most of the projects don't care very much anymore about standardization. Is that also your observation? Or do you think it's bad, or maybe it's just how things are?
I think so. I think this fits really well. One of the reasons that OAuth was successful was because it was essentially an extraction of existing practices. So when we started the project, Flickr was already doing essentially OAuth. They called it Flickr Auth. LinkedIn had a thing, Amazon had a thing. Who else? I think Facebook had something like very prototypical. There were a few others. I think Google had something that they were experimenting with, but it was a pattern that we had seen lots of times. And in fact, like the way that eBay payment transactions worked was essentially OAuth. So it was a pattern that we'd seen lots of times, and there was a library for doing each one, and each one did the crypto slightly differently, and each one was broken in a slightly different way, and like all of those things. And the OAuth standards effort was essentially drawing a circle around all of these approaches and saying, we're all doing the same thing. Let's get together and make sure that we're not making the same mistakes over and over again. And let's try and make it possible to reuse some of this code, basically. Like that's all that project was. And it's been successful because it was a thing that people used in the wild a lot. So I think with things like talks and these sorts of projects, the ideal would be that they would just sort of build something that works and then say, okay, well, we want to draw a circle around the fact that messaging is a hard one because messaging is really simple. It's crazy, stupid simple. The standard is tiny. We don't need much to do that. And you can see my fury.
He's been PTSD. Excessive standardization leads to PTSD.
Yeah. Well, this is part of the problem.
But it's worth it for the community.
But
Yeah.
But it's also like it is not just. I think this is the thing. It's not just about the technology, right? Like so, Talks has a technology that's great. There are lots of messaging technologies that's great. It's about the interaction. I think Google was right to sort of pull out of the XMPP Federation stuff because they were like, look, this doesn't do what we want it to do for our users. This does not work for our users. And if we're bound by the standard to build things for our users, then that doesn't work for us because we're trying to build something good. And so it then becomes this competitive thing, and there's like all of this social and sort of economic factors that feed into like that's why messaging is fragmented. Not, I remember going, this is serious PTSD. This is going to trigger all over the place. But like I remember going into Yahoo and saying, hey, we want to interoperate with your instant messenger thing. And they're like, okay, we can do that in 4 months because right now we're busy building bigger emoticons, like bigger smileys. Like literally that's what they were working on for the next 4 months because they had enough ad revenue that they could sustain their development team to work on that. And this was, and that was their economic social motivator. And so those are the things they're competing with, not like which technology do we use, because all the technologies are the same. Like they're effectively the same.
And I just think it would be nice if the decentralized web community sorted this out at some point, because it's kind of embarrassing. Like the basic technology, the basic design patterns, we kind of know what we want. And the fact of the matter is, like, everyone, because people are so obsessed with like particular differing protocols or standards, that essentially, like, you have decentralized silos. You're like, oh, come to my decentralized website. Like, your decentralized website can only talk to this other can't talk to my decentralized website. And there's a lot of creativity, and we're in a very creative space now. You have a lot of blockchain stuff, a lot of new stuff going on, new people. The fact of the matter is, still, we don't have like basic things working interop with any adoption. And this is problematic. I think, some of it is also finding use cases where decentralization makes sense. So someone's like, I want to do something in a decentralized way. Like, what social models would that work for? What use cases would that work for? So, for example, I work in a project that does decentralized voting, not because a lot of you have nation states, you have provinces, you have cities, and it seems like it's a sort of it's a naturally federated model. Maybe they want a federated protocol, but we don't know, right? And it's really hard to figure out. Actually, I think the decentralization community needs to figure out like not the ethical reason why we should do this, because we all probably agree on that, but why would the users possibly want to do this, right? And the last thing is like, you really, like something we see screw up again and again, we have to start with the basics, and then when you build up, you have to be able to take like standards are useful because there's so many like crazy crypto decentralization tools, and most of them are probably pretty broken. Like, it's a bit terrifying actually. And that if like human rights activists use those and they're broken, like they'll go to jail. Like, that will happen, and that will be the fault of the coders. And you really need to like actually listen. One of the benefits of standardization and the benefits of wide review is getting people who have different competencies than you, such as, for example, security experts or whatever, to actually look at your code. Because some of those, one thing you can get as standards by is you can get cycles of time from people who your startup or your nonprofit or your company could never afford to get that time out of. So that's it.
So guys, I think all we've got for this. I think there's an IPFS thing happening right here. So if we can take this
Last comment.
and carry on.
We'll talk after.
Thank you.